Every ending is a beautiful neon requiem, a glowing tribute to the journey we have shared and the lessons we've learned together. Join us as we close this chapter with style and prepare for a brand new beginning. Hit subscribe now and witness the beauty of resolution. I never told my son what his mother hid inside the old Whitmore clock the week before she died. When he and the woman he brought home started making plans around my death, I made sure every word was being recorded. One afternoon while I was in the back of the shop, my assistant called to me from the front room, his voice barely steady. "Thomas, you need to come up here right now. Your son is at the workbench. He's got the clock open." I'd been waiting for that moment for 2.5 years, and everything I'd built inside that clock was about to change everything. I'm grateful you're here. Before I tell you what happened next, drop the word protect in the comments if you believe that real love sometimes means standing between the people you raised and the worst versions of themselves. Quick note: this story uses some fictionalized elements to explore real lessons about family, grief, and greed. The message is what matters. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a clock shop after the last customer leaves. Not silence, exactly. Clocks don't allow silence, but a layered, rhythmic stillness, tick after tick after tick, that has a way of making you feel like time is both standing still and slipping through your fingers all at once. I've spent 37 years learning to live inside that sound. My name is Thomas Callahan. Most people in Savannah call me Tom. I'm 63 years old, and I've run Callahan and Sons Clock Restoration on Whitaker Street for the better part of 4 decades. The name on the sign has always felt like a promise I made to my father, and later, a promise I made to myself. The Sons part, I'll admit, stopped feeling accurate a few years ago. The shop itself is a narrow 2-story building with original heart pine floors and a front window that faces the Spanish moss hanging off the live oaks lining the square. We've been in that spot since 1987, when my father handed me the keys, a worn set of tools, and told me that fixing time was the only honest trade left in the world. He was a dramatic man. I miss him every single day. Inside, the smell is oil and old brass, and something sweet I've never been able to name. My workbench sits in the back, beneath a hanging lamp, surrounded by movements in various states of coming apart or coming back together. Carriage clocks, mantle clocks, long case clocks, cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest, porcelain anniversary clocks from the 1940s, each one brought in by someone who couldn't bear to let it stop forever. People think I fix clocks. What I really do is give time back to people who've lost it. My wife Margaret understood that from the beginning. She was the one who taught me that a clock isn't a machine. It's a relationship between a maker and a moment, and our job was simply to honor that relationship long after both the maker and the moment were gone. She used to stand behind me while I worked, hands resting on my shoulders, watching the tiny gears align. "You're not just fixing it, Tom," she'd say. "You're listening to what it's trying to tell you." She passed away 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in November, with the shop's clocks all chiming the hour below us. Congestive heart failure. She was 61. We'd had 34 years together, and I would give every clock in that shop to have 34 more. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You don't yet know about my son Daniel, who came home from Houston with a woman named Vanessa and a set of ideas about what my life was worth to him. You don't know about the Whitmore clock, a 150-year-old English bracket clock that Margaret left me with a secret I didn't discover until 6 months after her funeral. You don't know about the private investigator I hired, or the recordings I made, or the 2 years I spent documenting my own son's planning in a shop full of clocks that marked every hour of his betrayal. And you don't know about the evening. I called Daniel and asked him to come to dinner, telling him it was time to talk about the future. He thought I meant my will. He was half right, but we'll get there. Let me start where everything started 4 years ago. On a gray November morning, when I sat beside my wife's bed, and she pressed my hand and told me to take care of the Whitmore clock. I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later. Margaret had been the quiet force behind everything we built. She handled the books, the customers, the long phone negotiations with estate sale companies and antique dealers up the coast. She had a memory like a ledger and a warmth that made people feel, after 5 minutes in her presence, that they'd known her their whole lives. She was the reason we had regulars who drove from 3 counties away just to have her look at a broken anniversary clock their grandmother had left them. When the diagnosis came, she didn't collapse. She organized. She spent the last 8 months of her life making sure every piece of the business was documented, every account balanced, every relationship with our suppliers properly handed off. She made me sit beside her at the kitchen table for hours while she walked me through spreadsheets I'd always left to her. Pay attention, Tom. I'm not going to be here to remind you. 2 weeks before she died, she asked me to bring the Whitmore clock up from the display case. It was the centerpiece of the shop, an English bracket clock from the 1870s, fruitwood case with brass fittings, a triple fusee movement that chimed Westminster quarters on 8 bells. We'd acquired it from an estate outside of Macon 12 years earlier. Margaret had always refused to sell it. Some things aren't for sale, she'd told more than one interested buyer. This one stays with us. I carried it upstairs and set it on the dresser beside her bed. She lay there studying it for a long time. Then she said, "There's something inside it, Tom. When the time comes, you'll know to look." I thought it was the morphine. I told her the clock was beautiful and squeezed her hand and changed the subject, because I couldn't bear to think about whatever, when the time comes, was going to mean. Margaret died 4 days later. I put the Whitmore clock back in the display case, and for 6 months, every time I looked at it, I only thought about her voice saying its name. Daniel had been in Houston for 9 years when his mother died. He'd gone there after college business degree from Georgia Southern and built a comfortable life in sales management for a commercial real estate firm. He called every few weeks. He came home for Christmas. He was a decent son in the way that people are decent when distance makes it easy. He came home for the funeral and stayed 10 days. He helped me with the paperwork, sat beside me at the attorney's office while Margaret's will was read, and asked, only once and carefully, what my plans were for the shop. I told him I planned to keep running it. He nodded and flew back to Houston. 6 months later, he called and said he was moving back to Savannah. He'd been promoted to a regional director position that could be done remotely. He wanted to be closer, he said. After losing Mom, he'd realized he didn't want to miss any more time. I was glad. I told myself I was glad. And for the first 3 months, I was. He brought Vanessa Marsh with him. She was 31, with a quick smile and careful eyes that reminded me, though I couldn't say exactly why, of someone reading the fine print on a contract. She worked in financial planning, she said. Independent consulting. She was polished and well-dressed, and said all the right things about the shop. What an incredible space. Thomas, I can see why you love it so much in a way that felt like a performance rather than a reaction. I told myself I was being unfair. I'd lost Margaret 8 months earlier. I wasn't ready to welcome anyone new. I gave Vanessa the benefit of the doubt. The questions started that autumn. Not obviously, not all at once. They arrived the way water gets into old clock cases. Slowly, through gaps you didn't know were there. Until suddenly, everything inside is compromised. It was always framed as concern. Dad, have you thought about what this building would sell for in today's market? Whitaker Street is booming. Or over Sunday dinner. I read something interesting about estate planning for small business owners. You should really talk to a financial advisor. Make sure you're protected. Or from Vanessa, while I was showing her a French carriage clock I'd just restored. This is beautiful. Do you have any idea what your full inventory is worth? The first time Daniel asked directly about Margaret's life insurance, I set down my tools and looked at him across the workbench. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before glancing away. Just trying to make sure you're taken care of, Dad. I said I was fine. That night, I opened a new notebook. Nothing fancy, a black composition book I'd bought at the drugstore on Bull Street. I wrote the date at the top of the first page and began to write down what I remembered. My assistant, Pete Morrow, had been with me for 11 years. He was in his early 50s, steady and reliable, with the kind of patience that good clock repair demands. He'd been fond of Margaret, and mourned her in the quiet way of someone who doesn't have words for grief, but shows up every morning anyway. About 2 months after Daniel moved back, Pete caught me writing in the notebook after closing time. He didn't ask. He just refilled my coffee and set it beside me, and went back to finishing a cuckoo clock movement at his bench. A week later, he came to the back and said quietly, "Tom, when she comes in while you're at lunch, she goes through your filing cabinet. Just so you know." He meant Vanessa. He'd seen her twice. I thanked him and added it to the notebook. The moment I stopped hoping and started planning arrived on a Wednesday in February, 18 months after Daniel had come home. I'd gone downtown to pick up a part order from the shipping office and come back earlier than expected. The shop's back door was unlocked. I always locked it. I came in quietly and heard voices in the front room. "Daniel. Vanessa." I stopped in the hallway. "The shop alone is probably worth $900,000, Vanessa was saying. "And with the building, the inventory, whatever's in the trust your mother set up, we're talking well over $2 million. Probably closer to 2 to 5. He won't sell." Daniel's voice. "He doesn't have to sell." A pause. "He's 63, Dan. He works alone in a basement with chemical solvents 5 days a week. His blood pressure was high at his last physical. You told me that yourself." I'm not saying anything. I'm saying that men his age, with his lifestyle, don't always make it to 80. We have to be realistic about timelines. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Then I walked back out the way I'd come in, stood in the alley behind the shop in the February cold, and breathed. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the particular kind of cold that comes from recognizing something you should have seen sooner. I thought about Margaret, about the Whitmore clock still sitting in the display case downstairs. About her saying, "When the time comes, you'll know to look." That evening, I went back to the shop after hours and lifted the Whitmore clock from its display case. I carried it to my workbench, set it under the lamp, and looked at it the way I'd looked at 10,000 clocks before, as a repairman, not an admirer. I examined the case seams, the base, the back panel. I removed the back panel entirely and studied the movement. Then I pressed along the interior base of the case, the way Margaret had shown me once when we'd first acquired it. "Triple fusee movements leave extra space in the base casting," she'd said. "That's where you hide things." The false bottom released with a soft click. Inside was a folded piece of paper in Margaret's handwriting, sealed in a small plastic bag. I opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Dom, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong that I was afraid might go wrong. I don't know what shape it takes. I only know that I saw it coming in Daniel the same way I saw other things coming that I wished I hadn't. He's a good boy, but he's weak in certain ways, and weak people are easily pointed in wrong directions by the wrong people. This clock has a compartment large enough to hold what you'll need. I've left you the beginning. The rest is yours to build. You were always better at finishing things than I was. I love you. Take care of the shop. Take care of yourself. And when the time comes, act." I sat at my workbench for 2 hours with that letter in my hands. In the morning, I called a man named Frank Delacroix. Frank was 65, a retired investigator who'd worked domestic cases for a firm on Drayton Street before hanging out his own shingle. He was methodical, discreet, and had been a customer of mine for 15 years. I'd restored an anniversary clock that had belonged to his mother. He owed me nothing, but he showed up 2 days later and listened to everything I had to say. "I need documentation," I told him. "Not just what I've heard. I need evidence." Frank looked at me steadily. "Of what?" "Exactly. Of intent. Of conspiracy. Of the fact that my son and the woman who's pointing him is planning to benefit from my death. That's a serious accusation." "Yes," I said. "It is." Frank took the case. Over the next 8 months, Frank became my shadow and Daniel's. He confirmed what I'd suspected. Vanessa Marsh was not an independent financial consultant. She had a history of attaching herself to men with aging parents and significant assets. There was a case in Charlotte, an elderly woman whose son had nearly signed over power of attorney before a sharp-eyed attorney flagged the paperwork. Nothing prosecuted. Not enough evidence. But enough of a pattern to make Frank's eyes go flat when he briefed me. "She's done this before," he said, sliding a folder across my workbench. "Your son may not know the full scope of what she is. Or he may." I looked at the folder. "Which do you think?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "He loves the money. Whether he loves her or she's just the path to it that I can't tell you." I appreciated his honesty. I documented everything, not just in the notebook, which was now thick with dates, conversations, and observations, but in recordings. Georgia is a one-party consent state. Every time Daniel came to the shop and steered the conversation toward my health, my will, my life insurance, or the building's value, I had my phone in my shirt pocket. Every time Vanessa made a careful comment about what a shame it was that I was still climbing ladders to reach the upper shelves at my age, it went on record, and I began to build the Whitmore clock's hidden compartment into a vault. I added to it slowly. A copy of my updated will, revised with my attorney Howard Meeks on West Jones Street in February of that year. A letter to Daniel. The recordings, transferred to a small USB drive, Frank's full investigative report, and a photograph I'd found in Margaret's nightstand after she died, Daniel at 12 years old. Sitting beside her at this very workbench, learning to wind a mantel clock. She'd written on the back in pencil, "He was so gentle with it. I hope he remembers." I set the false bottom back in place. I locked the clock in the display case with a new key I told no one about. Pete noticed the lock. He said nothing, just nodded slightly, and went back to work. 18 months into building my case, Daniel came to the shop on a Saturday afternoon alone. "Vanessa was at a real estate showing," he said, and asked me to sit down. He had the look of a man who'd been coached. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the future." He sat across from me at the workbench, hands folded the way he used to fold them in church as a boy. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about your estate plan. About what happens to the shop, the building, all of it. When I die," I said. He shifted. "When things change," I looked at my son. He'd gotten his mother's green eyes, and right now those eyes had the quality of something carefully arranged rather than genuinely felt. I thought about Margaret writing that letter in her final weeks, about 12-year-old Daniel being gentle with a mantel clock. "I've been thinking about it," I said. "Let's have dinner next week. The three of us. I'll tell you where things stand." The relief on his face was immediate and real. Yeah, absolutely. "That'd be great, Dad." He called Vanessa from the parking lot. I watched through the window. She threw her arms around him. I called Howard Meeks that evening. Then I called Frank Delacroix. "It's time," I said. I chose a private room at the Old Pink House on Abercorn Street, Savannah's oldest restaurant, with low ceilings and candlelight and the kind of atmosphere that makes everything feel consequential. I made the reservation for a Tuesday, and I told Daniel I had something to give him before we talked business. Something from his mother. He called me twice in the days before to confirm the time, once to ask if there was anything he should bring, and once Vanessa's idea, I was sure to ask if I was feeling all right. "You seemed a little tired when I saw you last week, Dad. Maybe you should mention it at your next physical." "I feel fine," I said. "I'll see you Tuesday." Pete found me Monday evening, still in the shop after closing, sitting with the Whitmore clock on the workbench in front of me. He sat down on his stool and looked at the clock and then at me. "You doing okay, Tom?" "No," I said. "But I will be." He nodded. "Do you need anything from me tomorrow?" "Just be here when the shop opens Wednesday morning." He picked up a small French carriage clock he'd been working on and began to wind it slowly. We sat in the shop together for another hour, surrounded by all that rhythmic, layered ticking, and neither of us said anything else. Some silences are their own kind of language. I dressed carefully Tuesday evening. Navy suit, white shirt, the tie Margaret had given me for our 30th anniversary, dark green with a thin gold stripe. I carried the Whitmore clock in a padded case, which I set carefully on the passenger seat of my truck. I arrived at the restaurant early and sat alone in the private room for 15 minutes, looking at the flame in the candle on the table, thinking about all the clocks I'd ever brought back from the edge of silence. Daniel and Vanessa arrived together. She was in a cream-colored dress that looked like it cost more than the inventory I'd taken in last month. Daniel wore a blazer and had clearly gotten a haircut. They both looked, and I say this without exaggeration, like people attending a reading of a will. "Dad." Daniel hugged me. "This place is beautiful. Your mother always wanted to come here for our anniversary," I said. "We never quite made it." Something moved across his face. It was gone before I could read it. We ordered. Vanessa made polite conversation, the renovations happening on River Street, a restaurant she'd read about in Forsyth Park, whether I'd thought about hiring additional help at the shop now that the tourist season was approaching. Every topic designed to feel casual. Every sentence circling, at some distance, around the same center. Halfway through the main course, Daniel set his fork down. "So, Dad, you mentioned having something from Mom." I reached beside my chair and lifted the padded case onto the table. I set the Whitmore clock between us. The candlelight caught the brass fittings. Vanessa's eyes moved across it with professional efficiency. Assessing the way Frank had taught me to watch for, Daniel stared at it differently. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew that clock from 35 years of walking past it in the shop. "Mom's clock," he said quietly. "Your grandfather's clock originally," I said. "Your mother always said it wasn't for sale." She was right. I slid it toward him. "Open the back." "Dad." "Open it, Daniel." He unlatched the back panel with fingers that were steadier than I expected. He looked inside. He looked at me. His eyes went to the false bottom without me saying a word, maybe because he knew something was there. Or maybe because after years of watching me work, he understood how these things were built. He pressed the release catch. The false bottom opened. He reached inside and pulled out the folded letter in its plastic bag. I watched him recognize his mother's handwriting before he'd opened it. His face changed, something shifted deep behind the eyes, something that wasn't Vanessa's coaching. He opened the letter and read it. Then he read it again. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "What is this?" "It's what your mother left for this moment," I said. "She saw it coming, Daniel. She didn't know the shape of it. She just knew you'd need to be reminded of something." Vanessa put her hand on Daniel's arm. "What does it say?" He pulled away from her hand. Not dramatically, just a small withdrawal. But I saw it, and I think she did too. "It's private," he said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. I reached back into the padded case and removed the USB drive. "This is everything else," I said. I set it on the white tablecloth between the candle and Vanessa's water glass. 2 years of documentation. Conversations you didn't know I was recording. A full investigative report from a licensed private investigator who's been working this case since February of last year. And a revised will, filed with my attorney, that replaces everything I had before. Vanessa's face didn't change. I will give her credit for that. Her eyes moved to the USB drive, then to Daniel, then to me, and they gave away absolutely nothing. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a man who'd just stepped off a curb he hadn't seen. "Investigator." He said the word like it was in a foreign language. "His name is Frank Delacroix. He's been thorough." I folded my hands on the table. "I know about the conversation in the shop, Daniel. February 2 years ago. I came in through the back. I stood in the hallway and I heard every word." The blood left his face. "I know about the Charlotte case. Frank found it. I know what happened to that woman's son. I know what Vanessa is and what she does and how long she's been doing it." I paused. "What I don't know, what I've spent 2 years trying to determine, is how much of this is her and how much is you." Daniel turned to Vanessa. She was very still. "Tell him," he said. His voice was low and careful and terrible. "Danielle, tell him it wasn't what it sounded like." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Daniel stood up from the table. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He picked up his mother's letter, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up the USB drive. He looked at Vanessa with an expression I recognized. It was the look of a man recognizing a version of himself he doesn't want to be. "I need to go," he said to me. "I need to, I have to think." He looked at the Whitmore clock. "Can I call you tomorrow?" "You can call me whenever you're ready." I said. He walked out of the private room. We could hear his footsteps on the old hardwood going toward the exit. Vanessa looked at me across the candlelight. "You planned all of this," she said. Her voice was calm. "Impressed. Almost. Your attorney will want to see Frank's report before you make any decisions," I said. "I'd suggest calling her tonight." She picked up her purse, set her napkin on the table, and stood. She looked at the Whitmore clock one more time. The instinct of someone who can't stop calculating. And then she walked out. I sat alone in the private room for a while. The candle burned. Somewhere in the restaurant, someone was celebrating a birthday, laughing at a table nearby. I thought about Margaret. You were always better at finishing things than I was. I wasn't sure that was true, but I'd tried. Howard Meeks called me the next morning to confirm that Vanessa had contacted her own attorney and would be leaving Savannah by the end of the week. The investigative report, combined with the Charlotte case Frank had documented, was more than enough to make continuing untenable. She understood the exposure. Frank called an hour later. "She's gone," he said. "Loaded a rental truck this morning." A pause. "You did good, Tom." Pete arrived at the shop and unlocked it without being asked. He made coffee and put mine on the workbench beside me without a word. Daniel called at noon. His voice was quiet and very tired. "I need to ask you something, Dad, and I need you to be honest with me. That's all I've ever been. Were you afraid of me? In those 2 years? Were you actually afraid?" I thought about it carefully before I answered. "I was afraid of what I was watching you become," I said. "That's different." He was silent for a while. "I didn't know about Charlotte. I swear to you, I didn't know she'd done it before. I believe you. And I did, mostly. That doesn't absolve you of the conversation I heard, Daniel. You knew what she was suggesting about my health. You didn't stop her." "No." His voice broke on the word. "I didn't." "Why?" A long pause. "Because I wanted it to be simple. Because I wanted the money and the life, and I told myself it wasn't really a plan, it was just talking." He stopped. "That's not good enough." "No," I said. "It isn't." He came to the shop 3 days later. He stood in the front room, hands in his pockets, looking at the shelves of clocks, the way he'd looked at them as a boy, like they were a language he was only partially fluent in. He looked older than 35. He looked like someone who'd been handed a photograph of himself that he didn't like. I was at the workbench with a German anniversary clock someone had brought in that morning. I kept working. After a while, he sat down on the stool across from me. "I'm going back to Houston," he said. "There's a position opening up. I think I need to go back and start over." I set down my tools. "That's probably right." He looked at the Whitmore clock in its case. "Can I ask you something about the clock?" "Go ahead." "Mom knew. All those years, she knew there was a compartment in it, and she never told me." "She told me," I said. "When the time came." He nodded slowly. "She left you tools you didn't understand until you needed them." "That's exactly what she did." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that isn't enough." "It's a start," I said. "Apologies aren't enough on their own. But they're where starting over begins." He left that afternoon. He called from the road, somewhere past the Georgia state line, to say he'd gotten the position confirmed. He'd call when he was settled. I told him I'd be here. I was in the shop when Pete locked up that evening. He handed me my keys at the door and paused. "The Whitmore clock," he said. "Where are you going to put it?" I looked at the display case. "Back where it belongs." He nodded. "Good." I carried it back myself, set it in the case, wound it. The Westminster quarters sounded across the shop in the early evening quiet, and every other clock in the room seemed to breathe a little differently, the way they always do when the centerpiece is back in its place. Margaret used to say that a clock shop isn't really a shop, it's a collection of arguments against forgetting. Every clock that keeps ticking is a small insistence that the moment it's measuring still matters, that time doesn't just pass but means something. I stood in my shop on Whitaker Street, 63 years old, 34 years married to a woman who saw everything clearly, and left me the tools to see it too, and I listened to all those clocks insisting together. It's been 4 months now. The shop is open 6 days a week. Pete is still here. Frank stops in occasionally for coffee and to look at a Seth Thomas column clock I'm bringing back for him pro bono for everything he did. Howard Meeks filed the final paperwork on the estate protection 2 weeks ago. It's airtight now. Daniel calls on Sundays. The calls are short and careful. The way early trust always is built in small increments, handled gently. The way you handle anything that's been broken and is learning to hold together again. I don't know what we'll become, but I know we're trying. The Whitmore clock still sits in the display case. I've had 3 serious offers on it this year. I've turned them all down. Some things aren't for sale. That's what Margaret always said. And she was right about that. The same way she was right about most things. Not because she could see the future, but because she understood what lasts. Clocks last. The people who fix them, the people who keep them, the people who pass them on to someone they trust to carry the weight of what they hold, that's what lasts. Not the money. Not the plans made around someone else's death. Not the careful smiles and calculated concern and the voice in a restaurant telling you that men his age don't always make it to 80. What lasts is the work, the patience, the choosing, again and again, to fix the broken thing in front of you rather than throw it away. My name is Thomas Callahan. I'm 63 years old. I run a clock shop in Savannah, Georgia. My wife left me a clock and a message, and the faith that I would understand, both when the time came. I hope I have. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people around you, the things worth protecting, the difference between what we owe each other and what we sell each other, drop a 2 below so I know you were with me all the way to the end. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it. Some stories are meant to travel. Thank you for being here.